So my name's Larry Buller. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I have a studio practice here in Lincoln, and I do different kinds of teaching gigs and other assorted jobs. I'm a frequent Terry Gross podcast listener when I'm in the studio, and it's just a great way. You know, a lot of what I do as a ceramicist doesn't necessarily require a creative thought at that moment, so I can distract myself by listening to something interesting. When I'm applying decals to my finished work, that can take hours, and it's not all that terribly, I don't need to think about it that much. The design process for me is somewhat intuitive with a lot of what I do. And sometimes that can work in my favor, and then other times I think that might be a problem. Sometimes it just seemed like such a good idea, and I went with it, and it fell flat. But I also think that it's really important as you're working to kind of have that combination of intuition, but also kind of reflective making and kind of deliberateness to what you're doing. And I think that's what grad school did for me. It's like there's little grad professors on my shoulder questioning me the whole time. So it's something that I always kind of try and keep in mind when I'm making. When I was doing my undergrad years and years and years ago at UNL, I was really fascinated by screen printing. And now that I think back on it, that was kind of the heyday of Andy Warhol. And I was seeing a lot of imagery like that. And I really loved very pop artist kind of media-driven imagery. And so I think it was just kind of like a natural fit. And I love process. So again, printmaking had all the tools and the process and I always have been drawn to things that require equipment. That's why I've never, even though I'd love to be a painter, it's just like paint, canvas, where's all the process? Clay, what I love is that there's a making stage of the wet clay, then there's the firing stage of the clay, then there's the glazing stage of the clay, then there's the decal, and then there's the gold luster, and then, and so I guess I just find process to be kind of somehow satisfying in general. What I continue and have always loved about clay is just the property that it can become anything. It can just become anything you want it to become almost. And it's, I know that's obvious that it's malleable and that, there's all of these ways to manipulate it. But I would say the other part of that coin for me is the history of clay. Unlike textile, where most of it has deteriorated, or wood or other craft media, clay has endured and it survived, and so there's always that inspiration of like going to a museum and being inspired by clay that looks like, that was maybe made like 2,000 years ago, that looks just incredible, And the other thing too, in terms of my work, is I can use that history in all sorts of ways. This is very formal, kind of Rococo inspired, very kind of fussy, but I know a lot of clay artists that borrow from everything. When I was a little kid, my very unfussy, straightforward grandmother, who was not a warm, fuzzy person, had a collection of the most frilly teacups that she collected from who knows where, thrift stores, maybe people gave them to her. But they were in her house and they were so out of place. And yet she would have her friends over and they would break out this finery. And they were totally kitschy. But as a kid, I loved them. They were like, they had images of the Orient or of Turkey or far off lands, it's just like weird stuff. And I think about that and about all the times I go into places and I see ceramics that are just so, that's the word I use, I guess, is this lowbrow kind of kitschy thing. They're kind of masquerading as something that's a lot more grand. Or they're borrowing from the history of ceramics, but in a totally weird way. We're always surrounded by clay from the time we're born to the time we die. And everybody can relate to it, because they've used it, been with it. I love stuff that has a history. I love stuff from the turn of the century that is fraternal, like from fraternal lodges. I find the idea that men gathered in that time period, wore funny costumes, did weird little hand signals, and had this fraternal kind of adult club. I create my own stories around it, in a way, and I love collecting the objects. When I first started making work, and again, this was with Eddie Dominguez years ago, I think Eddie just encouraged us to go deep. It's like a writer writing about what they know, right? And if you're an artist, you have to kind of go with what you know. Like, I don't know anything about a lot of stuff. I do know what it's like to grow up gay in 1970 and 80, and I do know what it's like to live a life that is on the margins and marginalized and different than other people. And I know what it's like to be part of a subculture, and so I was like, okay, well, being gay does not completely define me, but it does, it is what I have to say. It's work about sexuality, fetish, identity. I mean, that's just what I have to offer. Like, I can't make a good mug. Nothing against people that make good mugs, but I'm just not gonna ever make a great mug because it's not my interest, it's not my content. And so I started to really hone in on the idea of that, and like, what is it about my experiences as a gay man who came of age so young when it was still really, I'm not sure how it is now, but back then it was like very much a subculture. You were living underground in a lot of ways, at any rate. And so I just centered on that as kind of like what my voice would be, and I think the way that it ended up becoming sexualized has a lot to do with the fact that so many people are still just hung up on the idea of sexuality and sexual expression and any kind of sexual expression that doesn't fit their idea of what the norm is. If you look at our political climate, and the fact of what's going on with all these trans bans for this and that, it's like, it's still so prevalent in our society. People cannot wrap their head around difference. And then when it comes to sexuality, it's like even on steroids, it's even exacerbated beyond. There's something about sexuality. So for me to just kind of blatantly put this out there in, like, sometimes it's like sexual toys, but sometimes it's other kind of manifestations. But for me to kind of put this out there in that way, I feel will hopefully kind of like create some dialogue and get people to start thinking that maybe gay sexuality or maybe sexuality isn't really that scary. And that, so I don't know. I have struggled with that question about like, why am I doing this, And I have a pretty good idea. And I would say, it centers around, in a way, kind of being in your face about it a little bit. I've been told that my work is kind of weirdly, both subtle but kind of in your face at the same time. It's very unapologetic, I think. My Instagram is just my name, lowercase Larry Buller. I would love to have you follow me on Instagram. I post a lot of process shots. I post things that inspire me. I put finished work up, and it's just kind of a way for me not only to show what I'm working on, but for me personally, I also connect with a lot of other artists that way. So I love the kind of networking that happens with it.